Welcome to Crucial Conversations number 6, Too Much Schooling and Too Little Education. I am Dr. Denise Taliaferro-Bazil, for those of you who haven't been chiming in or are chiming in for the first time. And I am the Associate Dean of Diversity and Student Experience in the College of Education, Health and Society. And I'm also a professor of Curriculum and Cultural Studies, and I do a lot of work around race, gender, curriculum, and power. And tonight, my guest is Dr. Armiya Muhammed. He was a doctoral student in our program, but currently he is a teacher. And he used to teach in Dayton Public Schools at Thurgood Marshall for a very long time. And then he just recently shifted over to Centerville, right?
No, I'm at Northridge. Northridge.
And he does a lot of work around Africana critical theory and education. So I am excited to have him here for this conversation tonight, where we'll be teasing out the difference between schooling and education and really trying to lean into the project of education is the most crucial element in rethinking our society for more equity, more justice, more peace for more people. So in our everyday speak, we often conflate schooling and education, but in doing so, we really flatten the revolutionary potential of education. That is, we are really unable to harness the power of education to change the world when we assume that it's the same thing as schooling. So in this classic text, Too Much Schooling, Too Little Education, and Wally Mushuja reminds us that schooling is an institution of the state, and its primary purpose is to maintain the existing social order. And education, on the other hand, is really a journey towards self-understanding that is culturally oriented. So I'm going to start off by asking Dr. Muhammad to talk a little bit about what the difference between the two are, particularly from his perspective as a teacher.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I would have to agree with what you just stated, but I look at schooling as an institutional setup in which it's the process of normalizing everyone, pushing us all into one box in which we're all expected to conform in order to, on the backside, come out as a finished product. I think it's the ritual of getting up, going to an established building, responding to the bell at the appropriate time, walking from location to location, going to the locker, sitting in the classroom to be taught by the almighty teacher who is supposed to be bestowing understanding upon us as students in any given context. Whereas I look at education as the opportunity for individuals to grow and expand the mind to a level in which they can critique their environment, understand their environment, and actually understand who they are as a person within that environment. And where, regardless of the curriculum or the content, or regardless of the actual core that you're being taught, be it math, science, language arts, English, social studies, France, or French, whatever it may be, it's how can you incorporate that information into one's own existence to manifest a more complete you? And I think we began to conflate it because it's easy. It's easy to focus on the one institution that we want to make everybody the same versus leaving space for people to become different individuals who have the right to think critically and to define their own existence.
Yeah, I always liken it to, like, when I'm trying to teach students about this, I go to my favorite text for doing this heavy lifting is the autobiography of Malcolm X, because I think it's such a poignant example of the destructive potential of schooling, really, and the revolutionary potential of education. So we know, for those of you who haven't read the book, you should. But what happens in the book is that at a very young age, he's in school in Lansing, Michigan, and he's the only Black kid in the class, and he's the class president. He's a high achiever. And he tells the teacher, is one day they're all talking about what they want to be, and he tells the teacher he wants to be a lawyer. And the teacher basically tells him, you know, you're just a nigger, you can't be a lawyer. you need to look at something more reasonable, which is something we hear, not exactly in those words, but I hear in my conversations with students all the time about that moment when they were told that they couldn't do what they wanted to do because they weren't good enough. And so we see it's not until that moment crystallizes, because he goes down a very rough road after that moment, and until he lands in prison. And it's not until he's in prison and he's engaging with his brother and with Elijah Muhammad that he really begins to study, and read and study the dictionary, and study different texts. And really he manifests education as self-determination. And so that's what I always say. To me, that's the critical point. Education can't be anything else other than self-determination. You can't force somebody to be educated. You can't control somebody's education. They have to want education, and they have to seek it out. And that's why I think, really grounding it is a journey toward self-understanding that helps you grow spiritually, intellectually, and as someone who is orienting their lives toward, making the world a better place. So what has been the impact, you think, of schooling on the educational well-being of Black children and other disenfranchised groups of children? Like, I always think of Black children, and I think a lot about the indigenous children living on reservations, and like they get mapped out of the narrative almost completely when we talk about public education, when we tally numbers and talk about who's not benefiting very much from the current structure of public education.
I would say that we look at the effects, the way current educational systems are generally set up. It forces Black students, and in fact all students of color, or of any other, I'm going to use any other group that's not considered to be part of the majority, to make a choice. You either conform or you're marginalized.
Mm-hmm.
And the space to find a middle ground is almost non-existent for those students. It's we want you to come through this system. We want you to end at the end of this road. We want you to look a certain way. And if you don't fit the norm within this specific district, you don't belong. Mm-hmm. And I think it's conveyed pretty clearly that you don't belong. I think you're expected to carry yourself a certain way, to dress a certain way, to look a certain way, and to respond a certain way, and to embrace a certain set of dictated norms. And I think that's what makes it so harmful, is that it's written into the informal or the hidden curriculum that you will obey and you will fall into these norms, or we will not accept you. Mm-hmm. And so part of that accepting process, I think, requires Black students to erase or sacrifice who they actually are. Mm-hmm. And then you have this artificial individual, this false you that they put forth every day in order to survive. So they exist in a state of protecting oneself versus being their authentic self and being the real them that they could possibly be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and exactly where we find ourselves. But I also feel like in schooling, it's really been about discipline and control, and clearly not necessarily educational development. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there can't be truly educative moments in school. They just are not structured in the school. You kind of got to go out of bounds to really center them for students. And it's not, I always think about the ways in which we reinscribe a particular kind of narrative around disenfranchised students. And so, for instance, you know, I think I mentioned the achievement gap maybe a couple of weeks ago, being really a fundamentally racist construction, right? Because it makes white students the standard against which all others are measured. And it keeps us not focused on some really critical questions about the value of education, because the achievement gap is really is fundamentally about schooling. And schooling has in schooling in our society, although we say this is, you know, this is what we have to do, you know, to be in a democracy, but it really doesn't attend to democracy either. It attends to maybe the economics, because it's trying to produce workers to sustain an economy, but not necessarily critical citizens, you know, to lean into a more just futures. So I always, you know, I think about the ways in which what's happening gets the kids sort of tied up in these narratives that really don't benefit anybody ultimately. Like when you look at a lot of educational policy, you know, when it's rooted in some kind of discrimination, it ultimately doesn't serve anybody, not even the people we think it serves. It just becomes, you know, a continuous cycle of disservice and more alienating for the students, but I also think many times for the teachers. We don't often talk about that they're having their own experiences of being sort of disconnected from the processes.
I actually think, you know, when you mentioned like teachers being disconnected, I guess
Mhm.
I'll use myself as an example, and some of the work that I've done, that it takes it's a painful and revealing process to actually look at you're playing a part in a system that once hurt and damaged you, but now you're helping to hurt and damage other children. And yet it can create a situation where you're not sure what to do in order to relieve that pain.
Mhm.
And so you're dealing with your own personal pain while inflicting pain upon another group of people with the intent of supposedly helping them to improve their life. And I
Mhm.
think that often gets overlooked, that we assume that educators in a system which is hurting children are not already damaged themselves, and that they're not struggling to get their own footing in
Mhm.
order to grow and develop and to find their own humanity.
Yeah. I actually think that's a really good point, because I feel like a lot of times the weight of the problems in the structure of schooling get laid on the teacher, interestingly, in a way that they don't get laid on administration, or they don't get laid on, you know, sort of the institutionalization of, you know, of these sort of different schooling practices. So I feel like we often forget about the teacher in this scenario, not just in K-12 and in higher education. I think I find the same pattern. And so one thing, you know, schooling for Black folks, first of all, we have to clarify that Black folks have always um, struggled for an education, right? We know that even when Black people were enslaved, they did all kinds of things to, you know, sneak, steal, hide away, to learn how to read and write, to get access to the word. And we also, well, I think another thing is about that, I think we also always assume that the enslaved Africans coming over, you know, in the Middle Passage, were not educated. Like we don't envision them as educated, but of course, they were some kind of educated within the context of their own societies. So we also know that, you know, even when um, you know, white establishments, white, you know, governing boards and things refused to support Black schooling, Black people built it anyway, in their houses, in their churches, in their, civic organizations. They made a space for it. So I feel like this tradition kind of continues. Like we would call that, a kind of fugitive existence, right? You have to kind of steal away to get your education or to get what's good for you. And so we are always having to create these spaces. Sometimes we can create these safe spaces inside of formal institutions, but it's usually temporary and liminal. And other times we create these spaces outside of formal institutions. For instance, actually, I would argue that before desegregation, we actually had a massive network of, safe Black educational spaces that weren't just inside of schools, but that were a huge network, a huge community network. And we had, wholesale organizations focused on that, like Institute of the Black World, or Forum 66, or so we had many organizations and places and spaces, counter spaces, some people might call them, to nurture Black education and Black educational well-being. Because I think another part of this is about it's not just knowledge that's being passed on, right? It's also feeling. It's also, like, I always talk about it in the context of loving Blackness, because we don't exist in a world where we're affirmed. So you can't take that sort of self-love for granted. And you can't take for granted, even a positive image of Blackness. Sometimes we Black people have an aversion to their own selves, and so the spaces that we're creating are not just, they're different than what's going to happen in school on a regular basis, because school is not teaching you how to navigate necessarily as a Black child in an anti-Black world. That's an educational journey. And to me, that has to be conveyed not just through the production of knowledge, but it also has to be conveyed in a discourse, in a politics of love. So I know that you've done some of this in your classroom, particularly at Thurgood Marshall. And so I want you to talk about that, the challenges of trying to do that kind of loving in an unloving context.
First of all, I would say that schooling requires us, or attempts to get us, to remove the human element from the learning process. So when you come in the building, everything that takes place outside of the building doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. You were just a student. So your whole educational path, your whole being, your existence is only what's codified in that building and in those classrooms. And it began with, the attempt to remove the outside from the inside. And so in the beginning, it was about a process of how do you unite and make it okay for students to be who they are on the outside with who they are on the inside of the school building, so that you can help them see and define themselves. Mm-hmm. And it started off, to be honest, with me having to look at what I didn't like about school and how did it affect me and how did it hurt me. And I reference back to some stories in which going to school and you look around and how early on in elementary school, they put you in these different reading groups. And the groups are designed to supposedly measure your ability of how well you can read. And they use symbols, and they would use cars and trucks and planes. And some of us always ended up in the big slow truck group, and we were supposed to be the low functioning or the low readers that were set aside in the classroom. And that stigma stayed with us. where some kids always got the extra help or a break, and others of us were pushed off to the side. And what would happen was it started off as an experiment. What happens if you actually open yourself up and begin to speak to children as they come in the building, not just as the teacher, but as someone who's concerned and who has similar experiences. And so that began and led to a space in which students felt that they can talk, not necessarily to me as the teacher, but to each other, and to change how they looked at each other and to address each other. And so when they would come in, we would leave, there would always be space. And so the question was always during a lesson or at the end of a lesson, once you presented the content, how does this play out in a social context in your environment where you live? How does this relate to you as a student, to you as a person? How does this affect you? And so the bonding of, for example, funding of education to the Black community around that high school. And you notice, well, if I put together a state report card and it reads F, 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 D minus, then what's the likelihood that a business is going to come in and invest in my neighborhood,
Right.
and then pay taxes to invest in my school system, let alone get employees to move into that neighborhood to help sustain it and to contribute to the school system? And so they began to look at it in the ways that, well, as a result of, quote, educational lack of performance or the achievement gap, people began to pull out of their neighborhoods, which affected them. They begin to notice that there's nowhere to buy anything in their neighborhood. If they want to sit and have a meal as a family, they have to drive to majority white neighborhoods.
Mhm.
And what was the factor behind this? We began to discuss, or they began to discuss with each other, when a student would come in the building in the morning crying and in tears, what had happened that night before, or what had happened that morning. And they would discuss how when they went into another teacher's classroom, how the teacher would fuss at them, tell them to pick their head up off the desk, but never once asking them what was wrong. And
Mhm.
in some of the cases, when we came to understand it, this student was upset because they had a fight with their mother, or because their mother was beaten by their father that morning, or because they realized that they had to take care of their little brother or sister, but there was no lights and no water in the house,
Right.
let alone food. And so we took that space, and what I did was at the end of every class, gave them room to relate the curriculum back to how it applied to them and how it affected them. And at this point, we were running a teacher academy. So the job was for you to decide as a teacher, after you present curriculum, how do you adapt this so that your students can take this information outside the classroom and use it to benefit them in the real world,
Mhm.
without separating or isolating themselves from who they felt they are
Right.
and who they felt they were. And that is where, in watching students grow and matriculate through various stages, I had to go back again and
Mhm.
look at myself. Students were at one point were moving faster and coming to a better understanding of who they were than I was, because I was still in a point of where you're denying that you are still the byproduct of this exact same system.
Right.
And are you being that autochthonous you? Are you original? Or are you actually some mutated hybrid that you tried to construct and put on a show?
Mhm.
And so at this point, the students actually became the teachers, because they began to show me, this is how you can connect with this space, this information, to what's going on in your life right now, and begin to make decisions
Mhm.
about who you are. And it allowed them to see their true positionality.
Mhm.
When you look at kids that are in a school, for example, that's 95%, you know, below the poverty line, everybody gets free and reduced lunch, yet all of the students in their own mind have convinced themselves in the beginning that they were middle class.
Right.
And so they had to go in and define the middle class. And one of the most painful discussions was hearing a young lady explain to her classmates that we are not middle class, that we've been fooled. We've allowed ourselves to buy into a concept or to buy into something that really is not us. And
Mm.
then to have them discuss and look at their neighborhood and what are the occurrences there is what actually led to that process and helping to unify them, where it was okay for them to embrace each other's pain
Mhm.
and to understand our existence as Black students is something that should be valued. And it's okay for me to want to be who I am. But again, the hard part for me as an educator is it puts you in a vulnerable position,
Mhm.
because you now have to stand before these students and be willing to let them teach you, But at the same time, you're giving your own self a whooping for not being a real individual once you realize the flaws within yourself, and you have to go back and retrain your own thinking. So we had all kind of created and I created for a praxis log
Mhm.
where you could structure a lesson, go back and you could re-examine how effective were you at teaching a lesson, but also how does that lesson affect me? And how did a similar lesson affect me as a child?
Mhm.
And you had to go back and try to reflect. And you gave that, and I gave that space to students. And surprisingly, like I said, there were students became the teachers because they were able to deal with their own pain a lot faster
Mhm.
than I was as an adult who was actually charged with the responsibility of leading them in a certain direction. But I think that's because we allowed a separation to be there between education and schooling.
Mhm.
And so by doing that, they begin to have critical conversations with each other, to critique curriculum, to critique each other, to evaluate teachers as a whole,
Mhm.
to evaluate themselves as a whole. It allowed them to analyze different types of material. And in fact, it allowed them to synthesize things, put
Mhm.
structures together in their own mind and how they could benefit themselves educationally as they move throughout that academy. And many of them went into the teaching profession. Some of them went into professions around education, but the end result was for everyone to be happy with who they were and to learn how to contribute. Everything was about contribute to your community, not walking off and abandoning it, but embracing the flaws in it, the imperfections, as well as the good things, and correcting the imperfections and enhancing that which was good in your environment.
Mhm.
Again, it was a humbling experience for me because as a teacher, you ignore that. We
Right.
generally ignore that. And a lot of those learning opportunities are hidden from you, or for lack of a better term, they're not in the book.
Right.
When you go to class, they're not written in the book.
Mhm.
Your pain and the child's pain and how to deal with it to educate them is not in the textbook.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's really poignant, and I can say that I feel like it's very also very true in higher education. And I know I've I've done some um, sort of navigating that space myself and really trying to create spaces for Black students in particular um, to to feel um, empowered and to feel uh, like they could be in a space and really embrace the opportunity to learn, you know,
Mhm.
the kind of history in the kind of way that's relevant for their circumstances and for their situations. And I think, sometimes the work in itself can be, as you say, very painful coming into some clarity about what's actually going on with you. Like I see students all the time feel disconnected, like you already know that they're in this deep in this process of sort of going through motions and not really being engaged and you know definitely alienated, um, especially in the campus space. And I really feel like on campus we tend to think about the issue of belonging for um, you know uh, underrepresented groups of students as a student affairs issue. And I keep saying, no, it's a pedagogical issue. And is deeply pedagogical in my mind. And so I remember I used to teach an African American ed class for Black World Studies. And, for me, that was the opportunity. I tried to create it in such a way that it was really sort of um, grounded in the world in a Black world view and perspective. And so, and to do that in terms of the choices I made about curriculum in the course, but also in the choices I made about how we were going to engage in the course as well. And so we drew on a lot of literature and autobiographical texts, and we paired them with some theoretical texts. Like one of my favorite pairings was Ernest Gaines' A Lesson Before Dying with Carter G. Woodson's Miseducation of the Negro, and sort of walking through that process of, moving out of a space of alienation into a space of embrace. And, in the process, opening up all these sort of possibilities for thinking about themselves in really different ways. And for me, what I really want to say to them, because I feel like, especially when we're young college students coming on campus, we want what everybody else wants. We want to, feel like we belong and included, like we fit in and like we have things to do and like people are going to respect us. Same thing everybody else wants. But I feel like when we don't get that, sometimes is so devastating, too devastating, and it starts to impact everything else, in their space. And so I always say, we can talk about, the student retention, Black student retention at a place like Miami, but even the students who come out academically successful, the question is always, are you spiritually well? Are you, intact in other ways? Because sometimes getting through those things is like, it's like going through a storm. And so, and it's not a whole lot of us who can, create those spaces where that's possible, where it's possible to say something about how this connects to the realities of being Black in this context. So, it's, I think it just underscores the fact, true, that we can talk about, that this, schooling is wrong or schooling is broken, but the truth is it's doing exactly what it was designed to do. And I think what I try to impress upon students is what's going to help you is being clear, about what schooling is and being clear about what education is. And if you can be clear that education is a much bigger project than schooling, then school is easy, because the school is just about following a set of rules, and moving through certain motions. And you don't have to give your soul over to it if you understand that, the promise is actually in education and not necessarily school when we talk about your well-being. But I want to say this because I know I get it all the time for being really hard on school. So I do want to say that I'm not saying that school isn't necessary or that it is beyond the sort of discursive and in some cases material violence that it enacts in young people's lives. But so I do think it has a purpose, but I'm not even sure, I think it has a really important purpose, but I'm not even sure how committed the institution is to that purpose. And so for me, that purpose is about, there has to be some place where we're all coming together. There has to be some place where we're talking across our differences. There has to be some place where we're actually learning how to engage and rethink a world that is, beneficial to all of us. And to me, you come to those places stronger if you are engaged somewhere else in the kind of education that underscores an ethic of self-love. Because to me, you got to be fortified. You got to fortify to enter, your average public school education at any level, as a disenfranchised group of people. So, I think it's really being able to hold both of those things at the same time and to think what should school be doing, and what is, you know, what is likely out of the purview of schooling because of the way it's designed.
I think I would agree with you that the process of school, in a sense of having a place in which education is supposed to take place, is necessary. I think what has happened though is in reference to Black students, I guess I'll go back uh, and look at some Fanonian writings in this context. You enter a space in which you've been over determined.
Mhm.
What you are supposed to be is already been stated and established for you, and it
Mhm.
has been held up. This is the model in which you are going to be. This is what a Black child is. This is what a Black student is. And so whether or not you see yourself within that mold, a rip from the very get-go affects how you approach that environment. It affects how you move into that environment. It affects how you engage it. And I
Mhm.
think that students, when they walk into our rooms now, they go on with the feeling that they're being attacked, that they
Right.
instantly have to explain who they are or why they feel a certain way. And I think that helps to force them not to engage. And I think we really have to look at the, we can say the good and bad things of school, but I think we do have to look at school as a institution has two components that make it hostile to Black, whether to people that are Black, whether you make it, whether you want to call it racist or not. It's indifference and arrogance.
Right.
Those who run it are arrogant, so arrogant that you can't tell them in what ways in which they need to modify to address the issues or needs of Black students. But there's an indifference to Black students also. We're not there's no adjustment to the situations, unique situations in which those students have experienced that are coming into your classroom. Or if they've already had a negative experience with education, how does that affect how they come into your classroom? So dealing with that indifference in an environment which is already indifferent, and then you come in and I'm expecting you to perform for me. I'm
Mhm.
expecting you to regurgitate information to me. I'm expecting you to show me the respect that as a student I may not feel or outright feel you have never given to me,
Mhm.
but and nor have you ever earned it, but you want it immediately. And I
Mhm.
think that goes back even to the and I don't know if this is the best time to mention it, but to the very curriculum itself, how it's structured, how it's put together, and who it's intended to serve and who it's intended to deal with. And as educators, we have to look at curriculum as the in an educational setting, in a teacher, in a classroom, student situation. That curriculum is the very DNA
Mhm.
of that situation. It is the DNA. And if the chromosomes are carrying mistakes, misinformation, biases, and then you weave it together, then you have your teacher walk in, and I guess we'll might as well go ahead and make it scientific. They're the RNA, and their job is to read and understand and interpret the DNA to encode, to decode it, encode it into themselves, then to turn around and give out information through pedagogical practices, but the DNA was malformed.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
then you produce malformed and maladjusted students who
Yeah.
become angry at you, and they don't want anything to do with what you're trying to teach them because it's completely it disregards their whole existence. For example, if we look at most history texts, our students aren't in it.
No.
They've done nothing. So
Mm-mm.
what you're telling me is if I want to learn about people who look like me, I have to go study my history, quote, as if Black history is not American history,
Right.
as if it is not intertwined back and forth in the same text or in the same context that the other events occurred.
Mhm. Yeah.
That and when I study science, I can't study the role of people who looked like me. We've done nothing.
Mhm.
We do nothing but benefit from something that someone else has done that doesn't and so that bothers a Black child, let alone how does it affect your self-esteem to know that your people have contributed nothing to the growth and establishment of humanity.
I think that is so, I can't, well, I'm a curriculum person, so you cannot overstate the power of absence in the curriculum, which is the whole thing that sets off my line of inquiry and research. Is this I had this moment where I think it's growing up, I really um, I didn't notice it, or it didn't strike me as deficit uh, so much growing up, because I had a family who, was always gonna tell me, no, Columbus didn't discover America. Here's a whole other history. I always had the counter story. But I think when I remember I was sitting in a graduate school class, and this class was called Race, Sex, and Political Style. And what we were doing in the class was reading autobiographies of revolutionaries, or revolutionary thinkers. So like we read Fanon and Foucault and Virginia Woolf and Pierre Pasolini. But the first book we started with was Edward Said's Representations of the Intellectual. And if you've ever seen the cover of that book, it has all these pictures on the front of it of intellectuals. So I think James Baldwin might be on there, Malcolm X might be on there, Foucault, Virginia Woolf, maybe Simone de Beauvoir. I can't remember all the faces, but there was no Black woman's face. And it just struck me, But then I remember pointing that out to the class, and then asking the class, like, so who would it be if we could put one on there? And it was just like dead silence. like nobody could, come up with a suggestion. And I remember that just struck me in a way in that moment, that, where you're confronting really your own absence in this really kind of layered way. And so I do think it just matters a great deal. And even from the smallest things, because it's not the curriculum really, it's not just representing who we are, it is producing identity, who we think we are, right? And so when we get it wrong, when we disremember, when we misrepresent, when we don't represent, all of this has an impact. All of this is generating. And then I think about it all the time right now, because the curriculum has generated this moment of racial injustice so clearly in my thinking. But it also makes me think about the way in which it sets us up to do harm to each other. So I remember I was teaching in LA Unified School District. At the time, I was an assistant teacher, and I was teaching third grade. And every day every recess, I had playground duty. So I was out on the playground, and two kids, Cece and Leroy. Cece was like, she was the really sassy, that kind of sassiness that would get her in trouble with her teachers all the time. And she had the like short, kinky hair and brown skin. And Leroy, who was her arch nemesis, he just lived to annoy her. And I remember one day she comes up, and I see them coming toward me on the playground, and she's like upset. She's like stomping up to me, and she's like, "Miss Denise, would you tell Leroy is getting on my nerves? Would you tell Leroy that I am not a virgin? I am Baptist," And so of course he's like cracking up. A couple of days later, she comes, I could see him coming, running across the playground again. And she's like, and he's running right behind her, like laughing, holding his side. And when they get to me, she's like, "Miss Denise, would you tell Leroy that this medallion that I'm wearing, this is not Africa, this is California." And he's cracking up, and I'm like, "No, Cece, this is Africa." And she's like, "Well, why would we be wearing something that with Africa on it when we live in California?" And so this led to a whole conversation about about African heritage. I remember introducing them to County Cullen's What is Africa to Me? And we get into this sort of long conversation about, they would ask me questions like, why aren't Black people don't wash their hair? Why aren't Black people, they don't think we wash our hair because we never in the shampoo commercials, or, we're never here or there. And so what I did is I worked with them and I put a little play together about, African origins. And one of the roles was Cleopatra. And so Cece was going to play, I had them audition because, I don't play. I don't care if you're in the 3rd grade. You have got to know your lines. You got to audition. And so she auditioned and another young lady auditioned. And Cece was clearly, like, she just had the sass and the personality and the charisma to do it. And the other young lady did not at all. Like, she could barely get the words out of her mouth. But the other young lady was my complexion with long hair. And the line that Cleopatra had was, I am the most powerful and the most beautiful Cleopatra. And so I gave the role to Cece, but the teacher I was working with says to me, she pulled me to the side and she says, maybe we shouldn't give that role to Cece because, she was worried about the children laughing at Cece being the beautiful Cleopatra. And I was like, that's ridiculous, But sure enough, she says her line. And right when she says her line, they laugh. She runs off the stage in tears. And then I spend a few hours trying to, hold her and comfort her and tell her all the beautiful things about herself. But, in the teacher's lounge afterwards, we are in this big conversation about whether we should be teaching children about their Blackness or not teaching children about their Blackness. And, a lot of teachers thought it was just causing more trouble than not to teach them about their Blackness. And my stance was really like, if we don't do it, they're going to learn about the problem of their Blackness sooner or later. And I think we should feel obliged to give them a more affirmative narrative before they have to confront that moment. But, it was a lot of disagreement with my stance on that. But, that absence in the curriculum, and then I would look on the playground where they hurl around the Black like it's an insult all the time. Like, you so Black, or, you Black so-and-so or whatever. And so in that context, you just see that they're like set up to, have this aversion to themselves, in this context. And so that goes on if you don't find spaces to sort of intervene and reaffirm who they are. And it's the everyday business of schooling. It's not an unusual occurrence or unusual violence. It's quite normal in the way that we do schooling, as a matter of fact. So I just think it's critical, and not just for the Black students, but for all the other students who don't learn. Your history is stunted. It's not honest when you cannot include the perspectives of, Black people, of Indigenous people, of, all of these people in the moment who would tell this story in a different way. And so I think, constantly we see the results of that now, like even when we look at the whole sort of tearing down of Confederate statues and this whole belief about, the heroism of these, Confederate monuments and Confederate, memories of Confederate soldiers that are like really sanitized of some of the terrible things that they did. But people believe, because they are circulating in the curriculum of this remembering.
I think often and maybe it's easy for us to forget that you can't have a value for something that you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And so if people haven't been taught, people outside of Black communities, outside of communities of color, don't know the other side of the story, you can't appreciate it.
Mm-mm.
You can't embrace it. You can't acknowledge it, nor can you have the value for it that helps to put an end to injustice or to racial discrimination or to indifference.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm not going to respond to something that has never come into my purview of understanding.
Right.
And so we have to make a decision is it, I guess, is that difficult conversation worth dealing with in order to grow and develop? Or is it better for us to deal with it when consequences emerge, when emotions are running high, when intellect is pushed to the side, and now you're dealing with rage because no one wants to talk about it anymore because they're tired of dealing with the situation that seems to just continue over and over and over again. And I guess in hindsight, I guess many would argue that it's always been preventable. We just chose not to put the issues on the table, perhaps because we were uncomfortable. We didn't want to discuss what was clearly obvious and what was in front of us, but we knew that it would require us to peel back some layers of our own and actually critique our own behaviors and our own assumptions at that period of time. And rather than deal with it, you push it, you kick it down the road and you kick it down the road. But inevitably, the further you kick it down the road, the harder it comes back and hits you in the forehead.
Right. And in anything and everything you touch would be a touch of violence.
Yeah.
Because you don't have that kind of reckoning with in honesty, because we are the history that we tell and the history that we don't tell. And so, I mean, you just become, I think, steeped in, many layers of denial, and denial will be the foundation for a loveless interaction with the world. And so I feel like we see that very much manifesting in our world today in many different ways. A kind of inability to engage with the truth from many angles of vision. I think that's absolutely critical for a healthy foundation for moving forward with projects of justice. But I feel like we are a long way away from that because a lot of the work in this current moment, in response to the current wave of protest and uprising, it's doing, I don't want to say it's not doing any work, but the work it's doing is a small part of the work. So to me, some of the work it's doing is it maybe is helping some people recognize their privilege or their fragility. But until you engage with that history, until you engage with the foundations of inequity, with the violence that the American society is born out of, until we can confront that, honestly, we still have a very long way to go on this journey. It is incomplete, and it would continue. The violence will continue if we don't confront and acknowledge that we've built a society based on violence.
I think ultimately it's going to come down to how do we structure and organize as a group of in the academy or outside the academy as a group of educators to construct a curriculum that empowers everyone,
Yeah.
that
Mhm.
doesn't marginalize anyone. And what does that look like? I guess is first we will have to, what does that curriculum looks like where everyone gets their, I don't want to say their just due, but where everyone is given the equal share of the of our history, of our educational system, and of our country, our contributions that we can all learn from. And how do we how do we weave that together? You know, what process does that look like? I think is where the work's going to end up being done in education. And
Mhm.
how we go about doing it right at this point, I can't give you the answer to that. It
Yeah.
will probably take a nice discussion between several people or several hundred people to come up with this is what needs to take place in order to make sure that everyone is educated across the board. And I
Yeah.
think when we look at curriculum, we have to look at it not just in the classroom, but what takes place outside the classroom,
Mhm.
because that hidden curriculum is powerful, and
Mhm.
how it affects people and how you address people, even when you're teaching core content, you
Mhm.
can turn off a child. You know, the old state of, well, girls don't do math and science well,
Mhm.
you know, and you decide off the cuff what people can and cannot do because they've picked up on something that's, you know, backdoored into their mind. Subliminally, they're told what they can't do. And so it's really a, what do we have to do to write a curriculum? And I think it's, we can't be afraid to come together as a group
Mhm.
of concerned educators and write that which will benefit everybody, that which will unite people. And I think that maybe we have this front where we're afraid to admit that education has to have a spirit of love at the center, and it
Yeah.
has to come from a point of, I recognize your humanity, and that's why I want to make sure you learn,
Yes.
not just learn in my classroom, but learn, I guess I'll steal something from Frary, learn how to read the world around you also, tap into the sensitivities of other people around you. And how do we weave that? And again, what does it look like? You
Yeah.
know, and I don't claim today to have all the answers, but, you know, how many of us are willing to sit and begin to write curriculum that students will be exposed to from K through 12, and then carry that skill set into the upper levels of education as
Mhm.
they explore 2-year, 4-year degrees, master's degrees, and PhDs. How
Mhm.
do we get that? How do we get to that point?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that sort of concept of love is crucial too, because I feel like we actually don't talk about it or teach about it quite at all, really. Um, and so it just leaves you to wonder, like, how do we do the work, without really talking about the concepts in a critical kind of way. Um, it is difficult. I know I'm been talking to some different school districts lately about, you know, uh, doing equity work, and you know, I really think people want to talk about, how teachers teach, how we deal with disciplinary practices, but I keep saying no, like the curriculum, not no to the other things. Like that's necessary, but the curriculum, you cannot do all these other things and not attend to the curriculum. Like it's not gonna significantly um, move the needle if you don't deal with um, a multiculturally um, relevant curriculum. I just think that's, and yet it's a lot of resistance to that. It's a lot of resistance to touching the curriculum. And I think, that's an acknowledgement and maybe, an indirect acknowledgement about, um, how we keep America white, even though America isn't white. And that happens through the curriculum, through the school curriculum, but also through the public curriculums as well that sort of reinforce these messages. And at the root of it is, again, this racialized human hierarchy. As soon as we decided that, there could be superior humans and inferior humans, and some people who we consider not human at all, that's like core to our whole knowledge system, that one idea. When we talk about better and worse and competition and how we rebuild hierarchies, we reproduce hierarchy over and over and over again in ways that people don't even think about it anymore. We reproduce hierarchy. And so to me, again, you can only take that apart. Taking that apart is a curricular move. You can't undo that unless you rethink the knowledge that reinscribes that notion constantly, all the time. So in that hierarchy, you build on eugenics, or you build on evolution, and then you build on eugenics, and then you build on it's knowledge that we think is neutral and noble is actually invested in the hierarchy. So it's really a matter of how do we address that, and how do you actually get at that in a curriculum, which means, and you said it earlier, that we have to prepare our students to intervene on the curriculum, and not just to receive a curriculum, but to be active in intervening on it and questioning it. Like I would say all the time, because of the way I was raised, I was, putting down Black history in the class for the teacher and the students. Sometimes that got me into a little bit of trouble, but you know what I'm saying? I was bringing it to the forefront because, I was empowered to intervene. And that's to me how we open that space. Like teachers say to me all the time, how can I get to know all, 30 of my students, and incorporate their lives into the curriculum? And I'm always saying, create curriculum that opens the space, because they want to tell you who they are. They want to tell you what they want and what they don't want, and what they think and what they don't think. We got to create a space, that's open to that, so that the subject we're dealing with is the students, and not, the history or the science, or that those become, the network of subjects around the main subject, which should be the students and the students' life and the students' well-being.
I think one of the things that I learned from working with my students was one of the biggest contributors to a feeling of disenfranchisement in education was the spirit or feeling of hopelessness. Mm-hmm. And I think what my students were listening to them talk, and them talking to me and with each other, and coming to an understanding of who they were, I think that they never wanted anything to be handed to them, but what the end result was, they wanted to know that there were options for them, so that they can make choices, mm-hmm. so that they could control or be in control of their life, right, without having things dictated to them constantly. Mm-hmm. And I'm not meaning it, nor were they meaning it in the sense of they wanted to be adults, right? But they didn't want to feel that they were powerless, just moving through an environment that didn't care about them, and they were just subject to the whims of everyone else around them. Mm-hmm. And so I think that in establishing a sense of being and identity, mm-hmm. it's ultimately going to be rooted in that curriculum which allows them the space or the room to actually develop the critical understanding of things inside and outside the classroom so that they can make decisions. And I think that goes a long way in helping to reproduce a thinking being, a human being, a complete human being. But again, that's going to take us back to looking at the curriculum, because we can't be, as educators, we can't be afraid to give our students space to synthesize that which is better than what we have. We have to give them the space to grow, the space to develop, and everything can't be limited to what we see. And in fact, sometimes what they see was actually going to improve our vision. And going to allow us to develop as individuals. And I think that's what we're missing. We're reluctant to give them space to grow because we feel as if we have to control.
Yeah, I think that's also rooted in the ways in which I always say teaching, I think, is intellectually rigorous, creatively challenging, and spiritually demanding work. And yet the way we think about it, we try to put it in a box. You know what I'm saying? We try to script it. And I think that's another hierarchy. I feel like that flows down. And I always say, if any group fit the description of Ferreri's notion of in the pedagogy of the oppressed, is teachers, because I feel like just like you were saying earlier, that you're trying to fit into an idea of what a teacher should be, in the way sometimes that very much limits the possibilities in terms of thinking about teaching also is your own process of self-actualization in solidarity with these students who are also trying to engage in a process of self-actualization in terms of the way they interact with knowledge, with each other, and with the world around them. So I want to take a pause for a minute and just say, if you all have questions, please throw them up in the chat. We will be happy to answer them. I did forget to say that in the beginning. So if you do have a question or a comment, just put it in the chat and we will address it. So I think, I know we both have really strong critiques of schooling, but I also think, you can't get to hope if you're leaning on, if you're simply leaning on the ideal and not really leaning into the reality of the thing. And so that's even the way, for instance, in which we think about democracy, for instance. I feel like even the way we teach it, even in higher ed, we teach it around ideals. Like, this is what democracy should be, or this is what we talk about our democracy in terms of freedom and equality. And I'm like, at some point, we got to look at democracy from the perspective of the people who are on the outside trying to get in, because that's where you're going to find the tensions and the holes and the gaps and the struggles and the problems. And I think that same way about, the critique of schooling. So we do have a question here. Yes. Wait a minute, the question went away. We have a couple of questions. The first one is, how do you think standardized testing has affected schooling, and how teachers are able to create curriculums that truly reflect their students?
I think schooling's been affected by standardized testing because it serves as a gatekeeper. Because those who do well on those tests are seen as different caliber of students than those who do not perform well on students. And I think on those tests, and I think an example of that would be, you may have a child who may have I'm going to use numbers, GPA 3.5 or above, but struggles to pass standardized tests. And I think that it's about rote. A lot of those tests are about more about rote memorization versus the ability to critically think and actualize material. And so I think it actually contributes to the negative side of education or of schooling, in sense of this is part of the routine. And where a kid comes to school at the beginning of the year, halfway through the first quarter, they take a test to make sure they're getting ready to take the next test. Then you come to the semester, you take another test to make sure you're getting closer to getting ready to take the test. And so we've gotten to the point where teachers have lost some of the opportunity to teach students for the growth and development of the human mind and for critical aspects, because they're forced to make sure they hit a certain content that's on the test and to make sure that they can answer appropriately on the test. Now, I guess that would require, when we were talking about curriculum, for teachers to come together and find out where's the balance between making sure our students are successful on standardized tests and able to function in critical conversations at one and the same time. And that means, I guess, changing the format of how we educate our kids and understanding that pedagogy is where we would have to do our work in that case, because we'd have to teach students the skill set to pass a test without teaching them or teaching to the test. You know, where we could structure some of the critical conversations that we should be having with our students to teach them how to analyze and synthesize and to apply education to practical skills on a daily basis. And at the same time, show them how to respond to those questions in a standardized test fashion, I guess would be the best answer, if that makes sense, as I'm structuring this in my mind as to what that type of curriculum would actually look like and what it would require us to do. But it would require us as educators to really, really, really evaluate, again, how we do curriculum. But I think the future of curriculum, again, is going to rest with educators, how we change it to make sure we determine the quality of education that's given, and how we evaluate what's successful in education. Does it take a standardized test where you color in bubbles, or is it better fit for me to give a child an opportunity to explain an idea, support that idea with positions in a written format? Is that child who can write and explain to you and give you an analysis of content any less smart or intelligent than a child that can actually color the bubble on the test and get more bubbles colored incorrectly?
Yeah, I agree. I just, it's so many problems I feel like with the way in which we are, you know, we're in a hyper testing culture. Like, it's overboard and it's ridiculous and it's beyond accountability. But it's a couple of things I would say about that. So one is that, first of all, the test is only for a certain kind of student. You know what I'm saying? That thinks a certain kind of way. And I do think if you are a critical thinker, then you are not likely to do well on that test unless you can separate, unless you understand what it is, that you're not there to answer the question critically, that you're there to give them the answer that they want, period. And I think that because there always is a right answer on a standardized test, even though in many cases that's, you know, the strength is in asking a kind of question that doesn't necessarily have one single right answer. So they're biased already, number one. But I also feel like they're trying to stand in for the lack of relationship in the system. And so what I mean by that, I was talking to this teacher one time. She was much older teacher who was teaching at the school where she was a student. And we were in this conversation and I was asking her about standardized tests, and she was saying, you know, when she was in school, they didn't have standardized tests because, you know, your teacher was directly accountable to your parent, you know, who they went to church with or would see in the grocery store on a regular basis, or what, you know what I'm saying? Your checkpoint was the parent. And, now that we don't have those kind of community connections and those kind of relationships, we build in this whole sort of thing that's just supposed to prove that what we're doing is, you know, whatever, necessary and valuable, or really, because honestly, we don't necessarily even use those standardized tests to really look at where a child is and how to move a child forward, right? We use them for numbers out there in the system somewhere. And so, and when you have those numbers out there in the system, it projects a particular narrative, right? It reinforces the achievement gap language, and then it's circulating around the space in a way that causes a whole series of interconnected issues to manifest. And so I don't think accountability has to be tied absolutely to standardized testing. It's not even necessary. It's not necessary. Actually, I mean, ideally you would have. The other thing about it is that it's not aligned. Like, it's not like who's making the test and what curriculum they're using to make tests, right? Like, your curriculum could be over here, and even if it's bound by standards, you can get to standards in a whole lot of different ways, right? And so that's disconnected. So my thing with it is that and I do this with my own kids. I'm like, I will pay for you to go learn how to take the test. Like, let's keep these things clearly separate, because the test is asking you for specific things and you need to know how to navigate it. How much time to spend on this question or that question, and where you should go first, and what happens when you get stuck, and just navigate it. And don't conflate your education with that task or that duty that you have to deal with in the system. So, I think it's always the tension for students, for teachers, for anybody in the school system. You are always navigating between what you're called to do and what you are required to do. So I think the standardized tests are not a good look, especially not the way we're doing them. So next question. First of all, I want to say somebody is shouting out the Institute for Humane Studies at Mason University, saying we should check it out. VJ's questions. I'm wondering how we can find a commonality between the purpose of education and the purpose of schooling. I'm trying to understand it since Paulo Freire's and John Dewey's time, but still struggle to get some solid answer.
That's probably the question we're all struggling with, to be honest. How do we find the balance between schooling and education? First of all, I guess we have to acknowledge that the process of a student going to school in and of itself is not bad. It's what we have done to the process of schooling by removing the human element from it and acting as if all humans can be essentialized into one massive cookie dough to produce the flavor cookie that we want. Mm-hmm. I think that we bring education back into schooling by allowing teachers to play a more active part in the curriculum that we're presenting to our students, and by understanding that you can't separate those children from what's outside, and that school is in fact a representation of their community, not of what we want their community to be. Right. But that means every ill that occurs in every single community, we as teachers within that school located in that community have to be in touch with those events. We have to understand the situation of that, so of what's going on in that community, so that we can teach those students how to read their environment and how to translate the knowledge that we are trying to help them understand to solve problems in their community and to project ahead to solve problems that will be coming down the road in the future. because knowledge in and of itself is worthless if we can't apply it. It
Yeah.
doesn't do us any good to just know something, to be knowing it and carry it in our head, if we're not using it to benefit our community, our state, our country, our planet. It does absolutely nothing. So I think it's going to lie in that merger between curriculum, pedagogy, and allowing teachers, educators to bring things together for our students. And I think that takes that maliciousness, intentional or not, out of the schooling process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like until we reach that moment where we actually do that work, that I just repeat all the time, and I'm sure I probably said it a ton of times already in a crucial conversation somewhere, but I say to my kids all the time, do not let schooling hold your education hostage. And so to me, if you do school and you understand what school is about and you know how to move through it, that's one thing. And then, I think the education is the bigger thing. And again, I think that, to me, that doesn't mean that there aren't really important educative moments that can happen in school. I think there are educative moments that can happen in school. And there are some phenomenal teachers, making magic in desperate situations, for sure. But I think the crux of the matter is that should be normal, not exceptional. And it's not normal. And that's what the critique is about. But it's instead it's exceptional, which at least lets us know that it's possible, but you probably take some licks for making that possible. I haven't met a teacher who is invested in that way who hasn't taken some licks for committing to that kind of work. But at the same time, I also feel like most of the people around that teacher know that this is a good teacher. They know it, even though that person, might make them, make everybody feel like they got to hold themselves to a higher standard or what have you. But I think that, it's that teacher who stands up and says, I'm walking out the room. If this conversation isn't about the well-being of students, then I have nothing to contribute to this conversation. And you would think that's the teacher who gets fired, but I actually think that's the teacher who takes the lick but keeps on ticking, in a lot of instances, because as quiet as it's kept, people respect that. They respect that courage at the very least. So I think there is possibility there. I've seen some amazing things. Let me tell you, I was doing a little tour of African-centered schools I was in several of them, in Detroit, in Mississippi, Columbus, and the Mississippi, Adiambo. I saw amazing things, children at very young age, doing things that we would barely be teaching, second graders doing sixth grader and seventh grader work. Students sitting around discussing Walt Whitman and Langston Hughes. So that, I think if we teach them, if we can transition our thinking about classroom management to classroom engagement, and we can open ourselves to help, to have them to have the curriculum be a co-created and co-invested project that, you know, they can do amazing things. Right now, you know, they don't think they can because we don't think they can. So I mean, I think that's critical part of it. So in so I'm saying in those places where, like in Idiambo, there is a marriage. There's a deep marriage between schooling and education. But that is, again, it's an exception and not a rule. It's not a common thing.
So when I try to find a commonality between education and schooling, I see that, for example, if we take John Dewey's definition of purpose of education, so when it comes to education, I think it has to do with the student and maybe the parents. But when it comes to schooling, it's a multi-stakeholder and multi-layer institution where administrators, policymakers, donors, teachers, students, parents, the whole education community is involved. So when I see in that way that how to find a commonality, because when it comes to a purpose of education, we have like students and parents, those who are thinking that what they expect from schooling.
Right.
But when it comes to establishment of the school system, it's a multi-layer and multi-stakeholder enterprise. So I mean, finding a congruality. For example, if we take that how far parents are from the boundaries of the formal education, it may be private education or public education, but it's still, I see that parents are far away from these educational boundaries when we talk about engagement. And when we talk about it's kind of a community feeling or meeting the local needs of the community through educating our kids. So that's the point where I struggle, that when it comes to multi-stakeholder interactions or collaborations, I think that's a point to find that how we can. I don't know how to say that, but I really struggle to find a congruence between these two.
I see what you're saying, BJ, and I do think, you know, I think that goes back to before us talking about how school is not really designed to do what we expect it to do in some instances. Like I always say, they're not designed to love Black children, and yet I think that's absolutely critical to you know, how they learn and how they grow. But so I do, to me, I've just really, I can entertain these moments when they are possible together. But for me, I really see them by and large is two different things. And I feel like it, so with my own children as a parent, I feel like I have to really take charge of the education piece, and I have to offer them more than just what they're getting in school. I have to, you know, pull them into more, you know, Black counter spaces and, you know, other opportunities where they can be affirmed as who they are. And hopefully that for me is part of, you know, fortifying them to go into these, you know, school spaces where you're right, there's so many other things going on other than, you know, what it is we really want to be happening for, you know, for our children. So yeah, I don't, there are no easy answers here. And I always say this, especially as a Black parent, I call this the Black middle class dilemma, because you move into these communities where, you know, they have good schools, but you think you're getting a better deal, but what you realize is you got a trade-off, more likely than not, because you gave up some things that were intact for them to have this schooling experience that's gonna position them well for moving up a doing well in our whatever capitalist economy. But does it say something to them about what it means to be a Black person in a world that is, pretty anti-Black? And how, if I'm going to make that choice, I have to pick up the slack. So I really think, I'll be talking to other Black parents who will talk about, how great it is that their kids got into X, Y, and Z school, or they're going to this school and they're getting this education. And in the same breath, we'll talk about all the trauma that this is causing their child. And really the stance is, it's for a lot of them, it's worth it, because the trauma is normal and not exceptional. And so they think of it as a part of, how you grow up in this world. And so it's I feel like you're always making those tough choices about what it means to be in a world that's not always safe, that's not always healthy, that's not always affirming to you. So you have other thoughts about that, Armiya?
I think going back and addressing the issue of stakeholders, I think that stakeholders are sometimes silenced in the name of bureaucracy. And I think that sometimes they get left out of the process of educating their own kids. And so there's no space given for them to actually voice their opinion as far as what they want to see given to their kids. And right. I think when you do that, you silence a whole community. Mm-hmm. And so you end up with a board of elected individuals who are tone deaf to their own community that they're supposed to be helping to educate, or supposed to be overseeing, for lack of a better term, the process of education for those students. And I think that's a dilemma that we're all going to have to deal with, because I think in that case, the educators end up in the middle, parents, students versus the bureaucracy and what they say is best for the educators to do to serve the parents and students, but there's no voice coming up. The voice is generally always coming down. Mm-hmm.
So that is a great note to end on. We're a few minutes actually past our 8:30 mark, but I just want to say, I want to give a shout out to all the amazing and wonderful, hardworking teachers out there who are trying to do this work under really difficult and limiting institutional constraints and circumstances. And I just want to say, for those of us who aren't in schools, but want to invest, there's a whole landscape outside of school where we can pick up some responsibility for, doing this important work that ties together education and love and, empowerment in a way that we help to nurture students who can transform the world, can transform their situations and transform the world. And, so I just think that's really important, because I feel like if they can't do that work, we're all in trouble, so it's definitely I always call it Reclaiming Education as Community Project. So thank you all for joining us in this Crucial Conversations. Join us in 2 weeks for our 7th Crucial Conversations. And this will ultimately be posted at some point on the website. So if you want to share it or go back and review some things, you are more than welcome to do that. So again, thank you and good night. Any last words? Thank you to Armiya, Dr. Muhammad, for joining us, taking the time to join us tonight and put down some knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Peace, everybody.